James Latimer Davidson grew up in York, Pennsylvania. His career in banking led him to Manhattan in the 1980s, Hong Kong in the 1990s, and Beijing in the 2000s. He has spent much of the last 30 years in China-related business, participating in China's historic economic development. He is also a writer and publisher of comic books and is currently working on a children's book based on the art of the 19th century Pennsylvania folk artist Lewis Miller. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing this screen and ask Jay to share his screen.
Great, thank you. Hopefully this will work. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, okay. I'm going to do play from start. Can you see my starting page here?
Yes, it looks good and you're ready to go.
Great, great. Thank you so much. And again, thank you for the opportunity to present today. So, yes, my story is about a Chinese vase that we have. You can see it here on our altar table by our front door in our house. And it has depictions of famous Chinese classical characters on it, warriors. So I grew up in York, Pennsylvania, which, as you can see, is south central Pennsylvania, south of Harrisburg, north of Baltimore. Here's what York looks like. And when I grew up, I've done presentations here before, and I mentioned I couldn't wait to get out of York. I thought it was terribly boring, and I knew I wanted to get someplace, but I never thought I would end up in China. And I think York is just about as far from China as you could get. It never occurred to me to go to China, much less to have a career there. And one of my favorite places when I grew up was my grandparents' house in York, Pennsylvania. And here it is. My grandfather, George Small Schmidt, married Josephine Foote Riefsteiner. And I mean, we all love our grandparents, but I just love visiting them and talking about anything under the sun, spending afternoons there, even as a teenager, as a young adult. They were just wonderful, warm people. And here they are. So my grandfather married Josephine Foote Riefsteiner at St. John's Episcopal Church in York on November 16th, 1922. George Schmidt was from a local York family, and Josephine Riefsteiner was the new lady in town. She had come to York from Westminster, Maryland, after the sudden and unexpected death of her father just 2 years before the marriage. And here's the lamp. So it was given to me by my grandmother after my grandfather passed away. And the occasion was that we were visiting with my wife, Louise, who is Chinese. And we were talking about different things in China. And my grandmother said, "Oh, well, this lamp is from China, so you should have it." And she said to Louise, "I want you to have this lamp after I've passed." So the lamp itself is 12 inches high, 8 inches wide. It was originally a ginger jar, and at some point in its lifetime was later converted to a lamp. And it was made in China sometime in the 1800s, possibly around Shanghai. My wife thinks that there are some particular ceramic villages around Shanghai where this probably originated. I actually, just for a lark, sent an image of it into Christie's auction house and asked them for an appraisal. And they basically said, your property does not fall into a category or value level that we handle. So what they're saying is it's not worth enough for them to bother with, but it's still a beautiful piece, and it's something we treasure. So here's my experience. Now, growing up in York, I knew nothing about any family connection to China whatsoever. When I married my wife, Louise, she was, as far as I knew, and I think still is, the first Chinese that had married into the family. Sorry. Um, and Louise was born in Beijing, and she grew up in Taiwan. We went on from York to spend much of my career there. We lived in Hong Kong for 12 years. We lived in Tianjin, which is near Beijing, for 2 years. We lived in Beijing for 3 years, and did business in Northeast China, which is north of North Korea, for 30 years. So all along, during all this time, I assumed that I was the first person in my family to do business and to live in China. So here I am with my daughter in Tianjin in 1992. Now, Tianjin's a city of 12 million people, and I think there are maybe a couple thousand foreigners at the most. So at this time, it was still very early in China. We would go, we could go weeks without seeing another Westerner. I mean, it was very unusual to have a Westerner there. And in fact, sometimes crowds would gather just to sort of, stare at you as you're walking around town. Here's a monk making calligraphy in 94. It's now hanging in our dining room. And here's Louise and I more recently on a trip to China in Guangzhou. Um, okay, so let's look at the two families and see where this vase might have come from. So the Schmidt family's been in York, Pennsylvania since 1812, and my ancestor John Schmidt arrived from Germany. My grandfather is the fourth generation of Schmidt family in York, Pennsylvania, and there's now 8 generations still in York, over 200 years living in the same town. And as far as I knew, no China connections. Same with the Riefsnyder family in Maryland. In fact, Westminster, Maryland is a very small town. My grandmother was the sixth generation in Westminster. They were, prosperous people, bankers, lawyers, shopkeepers, military men, and they had 150 years living in the same town. And again, no China connections that I was aware of. So I asked my mother. Now, my mother, recently passed, but she was 100 years old and still around and still very, very lively and clear. And I asked her where the vase may have come from, and her guess was it might have come from Europe because the Schmidt family were prosperous businessmen, and they would occasionally go to Europe and they would get various decorative objects and bring them back. So she thought that's how we got the vase. But the problem with that is that the subject matter is not what you would have found in Europe. It's decorated with very specific scenes from a famous Chinese novel, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms. So because the subject matter is Chinese, the vase would not have been made for the European market, as they would not have recognized the images. So this vase was made for the local China market, and it would have to have been purchased in China. Now, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is probably the most famous it's the most famous historical novel in China, and it's one of the most famous books there. It's like Huckleberry Finn or The Wizard of Oz. Everybody knows it. And it's about a fight it's based on real life characters that were in China and basically fought for control of China. So there's Liu Bei and his fellow warriors, Guang Yu and Zhang Fei, and all three of them are on our lamp. So it's called the most widely read historical novel in China. So here, for example, here's Zhang Fei. He's a very famous character, very brave and powerful, but he is much too self-righteous and impetuous and always getting into trouble. So my wife Louise was telling me that as a little girl, her mother would tell her, "Don't be like Zhang Fei," because she could be impetuous and run ahead without thinking. So, this was the kind of influence that this novel has on Chinese culture. So let's look at my grandfather first. Did the Schmidt family have any China connections? And I think 4 years ago, I would have said no. But actually, for my last presentation, the Genealogy Society, I discovered that there were some China connections. And let's get into that. So my grandfather's first cousin was Marie Louise Parrott, and she married Bertram Lennox Simpson in 1917 and moved to Beijing. So here they are. This is Marie Louise Parrott. She's my grandfather's first cousin, and she was a San Francisco socialite. And this was her second marriage. She was trapped in an absolutely disastrous first marriage to a famous California artist. And she and her mother traveled to Asia in 1916, basically to get away from this terrible situation. Her husband was openly having an affair and kind of flaunting it in front of her. And when she came to Beijing in 1917, she met Bertram Lennox Simpson, and it was love at first sight. They immediately fell for each other and married within a year. and she moved to Beijing to be with him. Now, Lennox Simpson is a very interesting character. He's a very prolific author. He's a highly regarded China expert. He's a global lecturer on China, and he was a lover of controversy. So he was actually considered the leading China expert in the early 20th century. And happily, his marriage to Marie Louise, my first cousin twice removed, appeared to be a happy one. They had two children. Lennox Simpson had 15 books published, both fiction and nonfiction, under the pen name B.L. Putnam Wheel. And I've read some of his books, and they're still very lively, fun books to read. The New York Times, in his obituary, said that he was regarded the world over as the most impressive Occidental in China. But the Beijing diplomatic corps thought that he was a troublesome fellow. So here's what Beijing looked like when they were living there. It was a time of great unrest. It was right after the collapse of the Qing dynasty. So there are many opportunities to buy artworks, and perhaps they might have bought this as a gift for my grandfather, her first cousin. Here's another scene of Beijing at the time. And here's a report from the society pages. This is a couple visiting Beijing, and they visited the Simpsons at their most attractive home that was a rendezvous for smart cosmopolitan society. So I'm guessing that their most attractive home probably had a lot of antiques. Now, unfortunately, Marie Louise's time in China came to a bad end. Simpson became caught up in Chinese politics. His life was threatened by multiple parties, and he was ultimately assassinated in 1930 by a group of well-dressed Chinese gunmen who invaded his residence in Tianjin. And his murder was never solved. And also by pure coincidence, where he was assassinated was not that far from where we lived when we lived in Tianjin. And at the time, I had no idea about it. So could the Lennox Simpsons have bought the vase and give it to my grandparents? So my take is I think it's very unlikely, because even though they were first cousins, they were not close at all. The Lennox Simpsons and the Parrott family were globe-trotting socialites, and they had very little in common with my grandparents, who were small town York, Pennsylvania folks who enjoyed simple pleasures like fishing and camping. Now, the Lennox Simpsons certainly had the ability, taste, and opportunity to buy this. There were many art bargains, but in China at that time. But bottom line, I think it's very doubtful that they purchased this as a gift for my grandparents. So who else do we have that's in the Schmidt family that has China connections? Well, this one I learned about really in the last year or so, and this goes back to my grandfather's third great grandfather, who is my namesake, James Latimer. My name is James Latimer Davidson, and here is James Latimer. So here's James Latimer, and he came to the U.S. in the 1700s, in 1732, with his father from Ireland, and he landed in Philadelphia, and he established a trading firm in Philadelphia, which was carried on by his ancestors. So his grandson, John R. Latimer, expanded the trading business to China in 1817, and he actually lived in Canton, China, which is now Guangzhou, from 1824 to 1834. Now, another thing that I found when I was doing this research that I didn't know about was that you can see here the two portraits. One is by James Latimer by Charles Wilson Peale, who you may recognize as being a famous portrait artist during the U.S. Revolutionary War. He did many famous portraits of George Washington and other luminaries. And John Latimer was painted by his son, Rembrandt Peale. So that's quite the coincidence. So I actually went to, these portraits are in, and this is me standing here, these portraits are now in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in their permanent collection. They were not on display, so I called them up and arranged to have a private viewing in their warehouse. So they very kindly made an appointment for me to come, and they took the two portraits out of the warehouse, and there they are. And they're really spectacular portraits. I mean, look at the level of detail of this stuff. Charles Wilson Peale was just an amazing painter. And part of his philosophy of painting was that you don't idealize the subjects, you try to show them as they really were. And that was very much of a kind with the philosophy of the American Revolution, which is what this is not an idealized group of, aristocrats, but this was everyday people who were, banding together to free the country. And actually, James Latimer was involved as a financier in the revolution. So here we have his grandson, John Latimer, um, who was a prominent member of the American business community in Canton and Macau from 1824 to 1834. So he was engaged in China trade from Philadelphia, and he would go, he made several trips to China starting in 2017. Um, and he went for what he thought would be, 1 or 2 years in 1824, but his trading partner and cousin, James Latimer, failed in business, and it caused a loss of $30,000, which is about 2.7 million in US dollars in today's dollars. And so John Latimer had to spend 10 years in China to repay debts and earn the money back. And touchingly, his childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth C. Keppel, waited for his return. They married in 1834, but they were too old to have children, and they retired to his estate, which is called Latimeria in their native Delaware. Now, here's a portrait of John Latimer by George Chinnery, and he's also a very famous portrait artist, a British painter who worked in Hong Kong and Macau in the early 1800s, and also in India. So he's quite a famous artist as well. And here's what the China trade looked like at that time. I mean, here's the ships. Here's the Chinese ships that would come up to the trading ships, and this is where the various traders stayed and worked when they were in China. So you can see these are called the hongs, or the trading houses that were in Canton, and each country had their own. The British were by far the biggest. Oh, excuse me, but the Americans had theirs, and you can see the American flag flying right there. And they lived and worked in these trading houses. And at the time, China had a very strict rule that no women were allowed in these trading houses. It was men only. And I think the objective was that they wanted the foreigners to be temporarily in China. They didn't want them to set down roots and establish themselves. And here's a view from one of the trading houses. This is what it looked like, with basically a sea of small Chinese boats, coming to and forth and trading with the various foreign trading houses. And what were they trading for? Well, most of it was tea. Everybody wanted tea from China. And here's a picture of part of the way that they processed this. And I think this would have been in one of the trading houses itself. So when I researched John Latimer, I didn't know anything about him. I was just kind of idly Googling Latimer, and it came up that there was a collection of the Latimer letters in the University of Delaware, and also in the Winterthur collection. And among these is a wonderful resource for me for this, which is a 300-page thesis by Joan Kerr Facey Thrill, a Delawarean in the Celestial Empire, John Richardson Latimer, and the China Trade. So basically what she did, excuse me, was to go through his, hundreds and thousands of letters and put them into a story about, his life in China and about America's trade in China. It's just a wonderful read. And he was a significant person, at least for the U.S. in China during that period of time. There were only 4 major traders from the United States and China at that time, and he was one of them. And he was a principal in the Terra Nova affair, which is a key incident in the early relations between the United States and China. Now, another way that he influenced U.S.-China policy was through naval policy. So in 1830, this ship, the Vincennes, I guess it was called, which is the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe, called at Macau. And the purpose of the visit was to ascertain whether periodic visits by American warships were advisable at China. And John said yes. He replied in the affirmative that it would be best to impress the Chinese with the importance of the United States because, as an American halfway around the world, doing business with people, you have to show that you have something to back up your rules. If something goes wrong, you have to show that there will be consequences for misdealing with you. And there are all these wonderful excerpts of his letters that are in the thesis and also in his writing. I really got to like John Latimer and felt kind of a kinship with him because he spent 10 years in China. I spent 12 years in Hong Kong, and we ended up having like kind of the same feeling. So here he is writing home and talking about homesickness. So he says, Canton is not home. It is as pleasant a place as any other, notwithstanding our great deprivations of country air and exercise. But there is no place like home, and that is the truth of the matter. That indescribable something that binds the heart to the scenes of our youth, be it on the barren mountain or pestilential marsh, can only be felt. It cannot be described. That man is to be pitied who knows not the feelings, for he can know nothing of the finer feelings of the heart, and as he who has never left his home cannot know the strength of his affections for it. So here's another scene of life in Canton during the time. And one of the things that they missed was dairy products. The Chinese didn't have any dairy products. So John wrote back and said, "I'll be greatly obliged if you'll choose me a young, quiet, small cow. It gives plenty of milk, and send her to China. A cow without horns and short legs bears a sea voyage better than those the reverse." Another source is this wonderful lady, Harriet Lowe. And if you want a fun read, her diary, a young lady's diary of 5 years in China, is just really, really fun. She's this kind of catty, gossipy lady. And she talks about all the comings and goings and doings of expats. And I had mentioned that the Chinese did not allow women in Canton. Well, she dressed up as a boy and tried to smuggle herself in. But anyway, she runs across my distant ancestor, John Latimer, in her book. And after he returned, he set up his estate, Latimeria, in Delaware, and he created a couple of what they call follies, which are things that you put in the garden which have no real use. And those follies have been purchased by the Winterthur and are now at the Winterthur Gardens. And we're actually planning to go back this summer and see them. So could John Latimer have bought the vase? Well, definitely. Yeah, now, in fact, I found the quote in his letter saying that on his return from China, John Latimer brought an immense amount of merchandise for his friends and family, everything from floor matting to chinaware to tea sets. And there were several Latimer family members that lived in York, but he was a distant relative. He was a first cousin 3 times removed. So again, my feeling is I think it's doubtful that he would have bought this. So let's look at my grandmother's side of the family. We've explored the Schmidt side and kind of come up empty. So are there any Reesnyder family China connections? Well, there is one, and it's kind of a fun one for me because at least on the Reesnyder side of the family, this is generally one of our favorite ancestors. This is Rear Admiral Andrew Whole Foot. And when I was growing up, I heard stories about Admiral Foote, and he had he had his formal portrait hanging in my grandmother's house, and he had a table which supposedly came from Japan. And my understanding, which I think I now realize was incorrect, that he was one of the sailors on Admiral Perry's fleet of ships that sailed into Tokyo Harbor to force the opening of Japan in 1853. But several of the objects that he had that my grandparents had in their home were from Admiral Foote. And here he is. So again, he's one of the most prominent ancestors on the Reesnyder Foote side of the family, and he's best known as being a Civil War hero for the Union. but he had many other accomplishments. He was a leading anti-slavery advocate leading up to the Civil War. And he was also a published author and the subject of several biographies. And as a sea captain, as a Navy officer, he organized a temperance society that resulted in ending the policy of supplying grog to U.S. naval personnel. So when you research somebody like Andrew Holfoot, there's almost too many sources. But one of the main sources that I used was this wonderful biography by James Mason Hoppin, who is a Yale professor, and it was published in 1874. And it's this wonderful kind of gung-ho biography. And in the intro, Hoppin says that, talking about Admiral Foote, he says, he was a true child of the sea, of a fluent spirit, moved by powerful impulses, loving honor, bold and affectionate. Yet he was more than this. To the simple sailor spirit of indomitable loyalty to duty was added a religious enthusiasm that it fitted him to contend with foes more formidable than winds or waves. So I think Hoppin was like a big fan of Admiral Foote. And the reason why Foote is, to the extent that he's remembered at all today, the reason why he's known is because he was in command of the Mississippi River Squadron during the American Civil War. And he took a leading role in the amphibious attack on Fort Henry in 1862, together with his Army counterpart, General Ulysses S. Grant. And it was a successful operation, which is a very important early victory for the Union effort because they had just suffered significant setbacks against the Confederates. So in the subsequent battle at Fort Donelson, Foote was severely wounded, and his injuries led to his death from Bright's disease in New York City in 1863. And here are some lithographs of the Battle of Fort Henry. And apparently Foote was on the ship and standing next to the pilot, who was the captain who was piloting the ship, and a cannonball came in and killed the pilot instantly. And Foote jumped over and took over piloting the ship, and he only realized until the battle was over that the cannonball had bounced around and hit him also and injured his leg. And here's a bombardment of Island number 10. So that's what he's known for. But the thing that I'm most proud of him for, if I can be proud of my ancestor, is fighting the illegal slave trade. Now, as I mentioned, he was an anti-slavery advocate, which is a great thing, but he also, he put his life on the line and he wrote a book about it. So the slave trade in the 1850s was illegal, but it was still going on, and it was done by pirate ships off of the coast of Africa. And those pirate ships flew the American flag because the rule at that time was that you can't stop a flagged ship. And so Foote volunteered for this service, which basically fought the pirates. So he would go and board the pirate ships and look for slaves. And if he found things that were set up for slavery, he would arrest them. And apparently he was very successful at that. So here's a scene from his book, and it shows previous pirate ships. And here's a quote from Admiral Foote. He says, "If ever there is anything on earth which for revolting, filthy, heartless atrocity might make the devil wonder and hell recognize its own likeness, it was on the decks of an old slaver." You can really feel his passion about it. Now, how did he get to China? Well, he was, of course, in the Navy, and at the time he was a commander in November of 1856. And this was during the Second Opium War between England and China, and the U.S. had declared itself neutral. But there were still Americans in China, and they requested protection from the Navy because they were kind of caught in the crossfire, and they wanted both sides to know that they were not involved in this fight, and please leave them alone. So in response, Commander Foote sailed the sloop of war Portsmouth to Whampoa Anchorage, which is near Canton. Now, Admiral Foote ordered his landing parties to avoid armed confrontation with the Chinese. But when he landed on land, and came back. He was rowing back to the ship, and the Chinese started opening fire on his boat as he rowed back to the ship. They almost killed him, which was, and according to Foote, and I think most people agreed with him, there is no other course of action but to retaliate for the gross insult to the flag. So Foote went in there basically to protect the Americans. He was a neutral observer. They observed strict neutrality on both sides, but once the Chinese forts, and there were four of them, started opening fire on the ship, they had to fight back. So here's a depiction of the battle. So the American squadron had two sloops, the Portsmouth and the Levant, and they were fired upon by these four different forts, and they attacked them on the 21st November, 1856. Excuse me, Admiral Foote, by now he's 50 years old, and he personally led the storming party of sailors and Marines. And in fact, he wanted to be the first person in the door at the fort, but I think a younger Marine outran him. And they captured all four forts, and they were actually outgunned by these four forts significantly. So what they did was they captured one fort and then turned those guns onto the next fort and captured that one, and so on until they had captured all four forts. It was kind of an amazing operation halfway around the world. So there was some debate as to how to respond to the initial Chinese attack, but the quote from Admiral Foote was that lead and iron were the best peacemakers. So the four granite forts were the strongest forts in China, with 176 guns, and reports of somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 Chinese troops in the area. And Foote's landing party totaled less than 200 men. And when the battle was open, all four forts were taken, and as many as 250 to 500 Chinese were killed, soldiers, and U.S. casualties included 10 killed along with 32 wounded, which was a significant amount. So after they finished the battle, basically Foote sailed up and down the China coast to check on other American expat communities that were there, because they might also be in danger because of the ongoing war. So he spent 4 months in 1857 basically sailing from one China port to another. So he went from Hong Kong to Shanghai to Ningpo and Fuzhou. And then after that, he went to Bangkok, during which he hosted and became friends with the King of Siam. And then he returned to Hong Kong and Shanghai again. And afterwards, he visited Japan and the Philippines before returning to the U.S., excuse me, in March 1858. So in all, he was in China and Asia for a year and 6 months. So he's there for quite a long time. And there's some interesting and kind of fun correspondence. So here he is in Bangkok visiting the King of Siam. And yes, this is the same king that The King and I is based on. So here's a letter written to his son Augustus, who was a little boy at that time, from Admiral Foote. So he's talking to his son here, saying, "It is not every young gentleman who can say he has a correspondent in this far land. Our sitting or reception room here is 60 feet square and 35 feet high, with a great deal of gilding about it and some 20 large mirrors on its walls. We have everything furnished us by the king. The attendants come crawling in on all fours, much as Willie did when he was a baby, and then they knock their heads on their floor as they approach you. The king lately lost 500 out of 1,500 elephants in a fight." So here's another letter to his wife that he sent as he was getting ready to return home. So he's saying, "My dear wife, we did not expect to go home before returning to Hong Kong. I wished myself to return to Hong Kong in order to buy some china, grass cloth handkerchiefs, and other things. But if we had gone back, it would have delayed us 3 months, because remember, this is the time of sailing, and it took time to get from one place to another." So in researching Admiral Foote, the question came up, how close a relative was he? He's my third great grandfather, but are there a lot of other descendants? that there might be closer relations. So one thing that I didn't know about that I learned here was about a ship sponsor and how the Navy determines who is a ship sponsor. So again, Admiral Foote was a Civil War hero. He's very well known. In fact, not one, but three ships in the U.S. Navy were named for him. Sorry. So in October 1942, the Navy launched the USS Foote, which was a Fletcher-class destroyer built by the Bath Iron Works in Maine. And this ship saw significant action in the Pacific during World War II, and it survived a direct hit from a Japanese torpedo, as well as kamikaze attacks before being decommissioned in 1946. So the launching of the ship actually initiated a formal search by the U.S. Navy through the Foote family genealogy. So what is a ship sponsor? Well, a ship sponsor, if you've ever seen a lady smash a bottle of champagne against a ship, as it glides into the water, that's a ship sponsor. And by tradition, the sponsor is a female civilian uh, who is invited to sponsor it to bestow good luck and divine protection. And very often they could be, royalty or Hollywood actresses or that kind of thing. But in the case, there's a very specific rule in the Navy in the case of ships named for individuals. For those ships, an effort is made by the Navy to identify the eldest living direct female descendant of that individual to perform the role of ship sponsor. So in the Navy, the sponsor is technically considered a permanent member of the ship's crew and is expected to give a part of her personality to the ship, as well as being an advocate for its continued service and well-being. So here's another thing that I found in the attic. I literally found a box of stuff from my great-grandmother in the attic, and in the box were these different letters and things, and I looked through the letters, and the correspondence was all about choosing the ship sponsor for the USS Foote. So in 1942, the Navy had chosen Mrs. Aspinwall, who's a distant cousin, as a sponsor for the USS Foote, as they mistakenly thought that she was the nearest and oldest living relative of Admiral Foote. So my great-grandmother, Eleanor Fisher Reese Schneider, responded with a complete list of descendants, which her son, who's also an admiral, Admiral Lawrence Reese Schneider, conveyed to the Navy, and they updated the descendants. So here's a correspondence with the Navy, official correspondence, going through our family's genealogy and showing who is the oldest living female descendant of Admiral Foote. So the Navy made it official, and Rear Admiral Jacobs wrote back to my great-grandmother, since Mrs. Reese Schneider is the oldest living granddaughter of Rear Admiral Foote, she would take precedence over Mrs. Aspinwall in christening the ship. Now, my great-grandmother didn't want to be the sponsor. She didn't want the glory or anything. She just wanted to set the record straight. So once she did set the record straight, she declined the honor of being the sponsor and let Mrs. Aspinwall remain a sponsor. But she was, as you can see here, invited to the launch of the USS Foote in Maine, and there's the invitation card, which I found in our attic. So, could Admiral Foote have bought the vase? Well, he was in China in the 1850s, and actually the 1850s it's a period of time when the lamp was most likely made. Other Asian decorative objects in my grandparents' home came from Admiral Foote, and his travels took him to Shanghai and several nearby China ports where the vase likely originated, and our family was Foote's closest living relatives. So my it's not definitive, but my conclusion here is that I think it's very likely that it came from Admiral Foote. And there's some other kind of clues that we can look at as well. So one was that my grandmother first knew about the vase. She knew that the vase was from China, and she felt comfortable giving it to us. So the assumption I have is that it came from her side of the family, because I think, when they distributed, the things in the household, they were very careful to try to give the Schmidt descendants, things that were meaningful to the Schmidt family and the Riefsnyder to the Riefsnyder family. So I don't think she would have just happily taken a Schmidt family side object and given it to us without checking with the Schmidt family. And we know from his letters that Admiral Foote was very interested in Chinese ceramics. So he said, "I wish myself to return to Hong Kong in order to buy some china." So most likely he bought china when he was in Asia for a year and a half. And in fact, I mean, he even said, "Look, it takes 3 months travel each way to go to China, go back to Hong Kong to buy china." And he almost thought that was worth doing. So he was very, very interested in buying these kind of collectible objects. And to me, the thing that kind of seals this is that the theme of the vase itself is warriors and fighting. And so the martial theme of the vase, I think possibly appealed to Admiral Foote's fighting spirit. I mean, here he is with a sword, and there's a Chinese warrior with a sword. He probably loved it. So let's look at the timeline of the vase. I tried to kind of piece it together. So in 1830, my distant relative John Latimer is in China, and he requests periodic visits by U.S. Navy warships. And as a result of that, 26 years later, Commander Foote, my great-grandfather, third great-grandfather on the other side of the family, sails into China in response to a request for protection from the American consul. And he visits these different ports in China where he likely bought the vase. In 1862, Admiral Foote died at the Astor Hotel in New York, and his daughter Josephine Reef was at his father's side and inherited the vase. Josephine, my second great grandmother, married another admiral, Donald McNeil Fairfax, and Eleanor Riefsnyder, my great grandmother, invited it from her. And at some point, the vase was converted to a lamp. So in 1983, we inherited the vase from my grandmother. And interestingly enough, the vase went back to China because we took it with us when we went back to Hong Kong. And I'm pretty sure we had it when we were in Tianjin as well. And I think we had to sign documents with the Chinese government to show that these were, items that we had before that were not historical items that were being taken out of China. So what did I discover through all of this research? Well, I mean, it gave me a lot of humility because I thought I was, pretty special for, living in China and doing business in China. But it turns out I wasn't. I was not unique at all in my family. So you look at, not only were members of my family in China, but they were involved in, pretty significant historic events. I mean, John Latimer was one of the very first American traders in China. And he was involved in the Terra Nova affair, which was an early milestone in U.S.-China relationships. Admiral Foote was the key actor in the Battle of the Pearl River Forts. And it's the first and still one of the only significant battles between the U.S. and China. He made the decision to attack the forts and personally led the charge to capture them. And then Lennox Simpson later on was considered the leading China expert in the early 20th century, and his murder is still listed as one of the highest profile unsolved murderers in China's modern history. So I definitely was not the first in my family to live in China, that's for sure. And that's at the least one of the things that I got out of this. So that's it. That's my presentation.